political affiliation aside when assessing the risk to the country?
Within the domestic terrorism bucket, category as a whole, racially motivated violent extremism is, I think, the biggest bucket within that larger group. And within the racially motivated violent extremist bucket, people subscribing to some kind of white supremacist type ideology is certainly the biggest chunk of that. I was appalled, like you, at the violence and destruction that we saw that day. I was appalled that you, our country's elected leaders, were victimized right here in these very halls. That attack, that siege, was criminal behavior, plain and simple, and it's behavior that we, the FBI, view as domestic terrorism. It's got no place in our democracy, and tolerating it would make a mockery of our nation's rule of law.
It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Senior MSNBC National Security and Intelligence Analyst Frank Figliuzzi is back. Plus, New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley is here. And with me at the table for the hour, former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman is here. Andrew, as a sign of how far the frame has shifted, Christopher Wray is now regularly maligned by folks like Lindsey Graham, who, in defense of Donald Trump's named selection to lead the FBI, Kash Patel, says things like, well, yeah, we got to clean out the ranks. I mean, who did Christopher Wray not clean out in Lindsey Graham's view?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not fact-based. This is entirely made up. As you pointed out, Christopher Wray was Donald Trump's choice after doing something that really was unprecedented, which is firing an FBI director not for cause. They claimed that there was some cause, but that was clearly a ruse. And so doing this again violates the whole idea of an apolitical position at the FBI. And Lindsey Graham, by making those statements, is complicit with it. In terms of your sort of intro, I think that what we are likely to see is the need for state enforcement. And I think that's where the story is going to be on so many of these things, because if you don't have the Senate and the House being up in arms saying, you know, we were as Christopher Wray just pointed out, they were the victims. And if they're not sort of upholding their own sense of being a victim and also the rule of law, and you don't see that coming now from whoever becomes the head of the FBI, you're going to really need to see the only sort of deterrent effect will be in, I would think, blue states and red states that have sort of law and order people in them, because other than that, you may not see sort of the federal government taking any action with respect to people who are pardoned or other people who are taking these kinds of actions.
I mean, Frank, the thing about a threat environment or a threat matrix is the threats are what the threats are. And the human beings only enter in terms of whether their eyes are wide open and able to see them, and whether they have the political space to sound an alarm about what they are. But a threat environment is a threat environment. And again, Christopher Wray described it as we played. Let me show you his efforts to sort of defend his claim on the truth with a very, I guess, skeptical is the kindest thing to say about her, Harriet Hagman.
Mr. Wray, from the Twitter files, Missouri versus Biden disclosures, the Durham investigation and report, and exposure and collapse of the Russian collusion hoax, the American people fully understand that there is a two-tier justice system that has been weaponized to persecute people based on their political beliefs, and that you have personally worked to weaponize the FBI against conservatives. Director Wray, what are you prepared to do to reform federal law enforcement in a manner which earns back the trust of the American people?
Well, first off, I would disagree with your characterization of the FBI and certainly your description of my own approach. The idea that I'm biased against conservatives seems somewhat insane to me, given my own personal background. As to how we are approaching our work of protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution. It starts with me having emphasized to all of our folks over and over and over again in everything we do that we need to do the right thing in the right way, and that means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it.
Frank, in Christopher Wray's telling, it is clear that by him saying there, I've emphasized to my people over and over again, in everything we do, we need to do the right thing in the right way, and that means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. This is an agency 9 years in, right, to Trump's efforts. Trump's first effort at weaponizing the rule of law is when he asked Jim Comey to, quote, see to it to let Mike Flynn go. And it happens in, I think, 2 weeks in, less than 2 weeks in, to his first term. This effort to malign the FBI, this member of Congress saying these things to a lifelong Republican and Christopher Wray, accusing him of persecuting conservatives and, quote, working personally to weaponize the FBI against conservatives, that's the four-alarm fire. And I wonder how far in sort of the brainwashing and the disinformation you think we find ourselves now in this transition.
Trump and his minions have spent years laying the groundwork for where we are right now. That is, when you try to talk sensibly and civilly with someone in the MAGA movement about this perception of a deep state, you hit the wall almost immediately. They have totally swallowed the pill with regard to the Russia investigation, the mistreatment of January 6 defendants, and on and on. And we're about to see Donald Trump become the first president to fire 2 FBI directors. There's really no more politicizing of the FBI than that, firing the head of the agency for political reasons. And the cardinal sins for Christopher Wray, I think, are 2. First, he had the audacity to speak the truth on Capitol Hill and call January 6 what it is, domestic terrorism. And he's refused to bend or break the Attorney General guidelines with regard to opening cases simply because a group or a person is an enemy of Donald Trump. So there should be deep concern about not only a diminishment of resources that have been beefed up to fight domestic terrorism, as Chris Wray says, the most lethal form of domestic terrorism is the far-right hate-based terror, but also spinning what's left of those resources onto far left. And the problem with that is I've yet to see the actual legal predication in a far left organization. That's not to say that we didn't see violence and riots, that we didn't see people that might call themselves Antifa doing violent things. But in terms of the actual predication to open full-blown cases, I've not seen that yet on a solid organizational structure. So what's going to happen? You're going to have to fabricate the predication. And I wouldn't put it past the nominees for AG and director to do just that.
What does that look like, though? I mean, you can't do that on your own. Where do you find partners for an effort like what you're describing, Frank, inside the FBI?
Well, there's going to be plenty of partners across the intel agency. Look, DHS. Every one of these cabinet level positions is going to be loyal to Trump and Trump alone. The U.S. attorneys are going to all be dismissed, as is traditional, by the way, with the new president often. And they're going to be replaced, though, with Trump loyalists. So you could literally have an FBI director in Washington and maybe even special agents in charge within field offices swearing some kind of allegiance to Trump, along with the chief prosecutor for that judicial district. And now you've got a recipe for looking the other way. The partners will be there, and there'll be certain sheriffs and police chiefs who will be happy to be on that task force. They already are, and go along with that.
Michael Crowley, I want to bring you in on the other pick that's raising alarms. NBC News has reported that nearly 100 former national security officials are alarmed at the prospect of Tulsi Gabbard leading the intelligence community. I'll read from that reporting. Nearly 100 former national security officials signed a letter criticizing President-elect Donald Trump's decision to nominate former Representative Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence and called for closed-door Senate hearings to review any government information about her. In the letter obtained by NBC News, the officials urged the Senate to, quote, carefully evaluate whether Gabbard is equipped for the position. Several of Ms. Gabbard's past actions call into question her ability to deliver unbiased intelligence briefings to the president, Congress, and the entire national security apparatus. The letter says following her trip to Syria, for example, Ms. Gabbard aligned herself with Russian and Syrian officials. As a sort of aside, the letter argues that she would also, quote, be the least experienced person to hold the director position since it was created in 2004. Of course, in the wake of the September 11th attacks, that position was created to sort of gather and aggregate intelligence for the consumers, largely the president. You're reporting on the degree of concern and alarm about what Frank's talking about, the intersectionality of all these appointments.
Well, Nicole, it's extremely high. And, you know, some other nominees have been getting more attention lately, particularly Pete Hegseth. But I think that, you know, the national security ramifications, if you take seriously the concerns that are being put forward here of having someone running the intelligence community who some senators clearly believe might be compromised or might be influenced in some way that you can only talk about behind closed doors, you know, is very serious. The suggestion that it should be discussed behind closed doors implies that there might be information about her that comes from intelligence that you can't talk about publicly because it could involve sources and methods. And that would get into the terrain of, you know, whether there's some kind of an espionage angle here or some sort of a relationship with another country that we only know through classified means. So that's obviously extremely serious, but, you know, leave aside the qualification question, leave aside whether she has the experience and the credentials for this job, which, by the way, you know, you mentioned the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. That is a job, although the CIA director is a much more famous position. The CIA director actually reports to the Director of National Intelligence. And the DNI was created to coordinate the entire intelligence committee. But, you know, so you have the qualification question, which would be very serious in any event. And then you have, you know, these questions that people have about really where, what her worldview is and where it comes from. And the last point I'll make on that, Nicole, you mentioned the trip to Syria and this idea that she said some things that were not consistent with U.S. intelligence. She endorsed a theory promoted by Bashar Assad's regime, the Iranian government in Tehran, and also the Russians, which ran against a global consensus, including the findings of the United Nations. And that theory was that the Assad regime had not used chemical weapons against the Syrian opposition, that in fact it was the Syrian rebels themselves who were using chemical weapons, and that it was some sort of a false flag attack. I mean, virtually no one who the United States considers a credible messenger on this subject agreed with that. I mean, I'm not aware of anyone. It's these hostile governments like Iran and Russia. So that's an example, and the U.S. Intelligence Committee had no doubts about this. So you have the qualifications, but then you have this very strange question of why she would support a theory like that, that really seems to have no basis in fact, certainly among credible sources in the United States.
Well, I mean, what's amazing, too, Andrew, is it's not consistent with what Rubio said at the time. I mean, if you're looking for any sort of signal